Hello, and welcome to Future Chat. I'm Elizabeth Merritt, Founding Director of the Center for the Future of Museums and Vice President of Strategic Foresight at the American Alliance of Museums. I am so happy you are joining me today for the first in a new series from the Center for the Future of Museums. We're starting the Future Chats as an informal way to do a little bit of foresight with people in the museum field, teach a little bit of the skills of doing futures thinking, share a piece of news from the scanning I do every day, and model for how you can think and talk about it when you explore implications about the news you see popping up in your feeds. It's also a chance for you to network with some of your museum peers, because one thing we've heard at the Alliance is that people want more networking opportunities. So that's both going to be virtually face-to-face when we break you out into chat rooms, discussion groups later in the chat, but also using the chat feature of the AirMeet platform. So you will see that there is a little chat button over to the right of your screen. And I'd like to encourage you to get used to using that by dropping in right now your name and where you're from. If you're joining from a museum, tell us your museum so that I can see you're here and get a feeling for who's in the audience. While you're starting that, and I'm going to model good behavior and type in hello from Elizabeth so you can see if you're seeing that in your chat. Awesome. And hello, Diane. Credit for being the first person to jump in. Before we dive into Future Chat, I want to tell you a little bit about the culture of the event that I'm trying to build. It's going to be a little bit light and humorous, even though we're going to be talking about very serious topics, because heck, you need a little levity sometimes to deal with the news nowadays. I also am really hoping it's a place that we can come together and share our hopes and our fears and our thoughts and our anxieties. So for that reason, I would like to implement a little cone of confidentiality. We are going to share the introduction where I'm chatting with our special guest, who you'll meet soon. But once you go out into breakout rooms, that's confidential. Please feel free to share with each other, surface these things that you'd rather not have out in public. And when you leave the room, absolutely share your insights, share your thoughts, what you learned, but keep confidential who said what about something that they did or thought. All right, so here's how the agenda for the day is going to work. I am going to introduce a piece of news that popped up in my scanning feeds that I thought was interesting. In today's chat, it's about the topic of climate risk and climate change. Then I will introduce our special guest for the day, who will help me explore some of the implications of that piece of news. Then we will send you out into little breakout rooms, just 5 of you in each room, with suggestions to guide your conversation about this topic. So you'll have a good chunk of time to talk it over and share thoughts and surface insights and ideas and questions. Then we're going to bring you back together in this main room at the end of the hour to share some insights, again via chat. Now, throughout, please throw questions, thoughts, observations into the chat window. Marcy and I let slip who our special guest is, are going to keep an eye on chat. We'll answer any questions that pop up as far as we can. But, even if we don't get to it in this hour, we'll find some way to address it later, maybe in a blog post. All right. Before we get started, I'd like to establish a little data baseline for this first chat about the impact of climate change. So what I am going to do is push a poll out to you that asks about how you have personally been affected by climate risk. And you'll see that you have options. If you scroll down, the answer might be not at all. It might be somewhat. It might be profoundly. My house got flooded and I had to move. So before we dive in, I'd just like to know how this has impacted your personal or work life so far. And I see the votes ticking up. And so far, the vast majority, about 3/4, seems to be somewhat, though there's a solid 20% or so, about 1/5 of people saying profoundly. My empathy to you for having to deal with these climate impacts, and maybe we'll hear about that a little later. Let me give it a couple more minutes to run so we can let everybody weigh in. Okay, ticking up still, not changing. Oh, up to 1/4 of the people in the audience are saying profound impact from climate risk. I have to say, I'm not surprised, but it's a little depressing. Okay. And I think you've all weighed in, so I'm going to close the poll now. So that is 20, rounding here, 25% of people saying they've been profoundly impacted by climate risk, extreme heat, flooding, sea level change, wildfires, severe storms. About 73%, 72% saying somewhat impacted, and a mere 3.36% saying they've been impacted not at all. And I dare say this is pretty representative of the experience of your colleagues in the museum sector throughout the US and the people in your community. So that's a good context in which to dive into these discussions. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll now and introduce the signal of change that is sparking our discussion today. So a signal of change in Foresight speak is just some piece of news from out in the world that gives us something to think about. It's something that tells us something about what's going on in the world and might suggest what trends are. It might be a piece of news about a disruptive event. In this case, it is a story from the Las Vegas Review-Journal that popped up in my scanning feed on July 10th. And the headline was, "Neon Museum temporarily closes during day due to extreme heat." Okay, this is the Neon Museum in Las Vegas, and it goes on to say, "The Neon Museum has announced that it will be closing during the day because of extreme heat, with temperatures needing to fall below a certain threshold before the museum will open its doors. Once temperatures fall below, wait for it, 110 degrees, the museum will reopen," a spokesperson said. "This week, that's usually been around 8:30 to 9 p.m. Okay, I think you can see why that opened my eyes and made me think. And if anyone is joining us today from the Neon Museum, please let me know. Well, I am very pleased to welcome to the stage my special guest today, Marcy Rockman, who's going to chat with me about the signal of change. Marcy is an archaeologist who's held multiple roles in national and international climate change, science, and policy. She's currently director and principal of Lifting Rocks Climate and Heritage Consulting and associate research professor with the Department of Anthropology at the University of Maryland in College Park. And I am going to drop a link in the chat to Marcy's bio on Lifting Rocks so that you can read more about her. So Marcy, hello.
Hi, Elizabeth. It's nice to see you, and hello to everyone. I'm delighted to be here, to be joining all of you, and it's been so wonderful to see all the places that everyone is from going by in the chat. So I'm based in Washington, D.C., which I think I saw go by once, at least once, which is really nice, but we have quite an array and a spread.
Well, one of my great joys in the work I do for the Alliance is getting to meet all sorts of interesting people. And another thing I'm really excited about with future chats is the chance to bring some of these people on stage to share them and their wisdom with you. And in this case, when I saw this signal, I said to Marcy, I'd love you to talk a bit based on your experience. What are some thoughts you have about this signal of change? What comes to your mind when you read this story of extreme heat and how it's affecting this one museum in Las Vegas?
Yeah, so I have multiple thoughts that have come to mind, and the way I'll share them is to say the biography that Elizabeth very kindly shared is one of two hats that I wear. I certainly have a policy hat. I've worked in DC. I've worked with the National Park Service, with climate and heritage policy, with Congress. I've done some international work. But I also bring another hat to this conversation. It's my battered fieldwork hat. My training is in anthropological archaeology. And my longstanding research in the field of archaeology is about how humans learn unfamiliar landscapes, how they learn unfamiliar places. And my frame is, like if you picture the first peoples entering the Americas when there was no one else here, how did they start to figure out where things were and how to live there? When I began as an archaeologist, I first was thinking of this as, okay, it's blank slate. How did they start to figure out where everything is? What quickly became apparent as I started to look at a number of different case examples is the blank slate is seldom, if ever, true, because everyone is coming from somewhere and they're bringing with them ideas and expectations and language and ways of practicing. And even if they know that the place that they're arriving in is different, they still have those built-in practices and assumptions and languages. So what the whole landscape learning process is very often a dialogue between past and present, between knowledge and new experience, and figuring out what works in this new place and what does not, and how do we change, and how do we build that up. Several years ago, before I came to DC, I was living out in Southern California, and as happens out there, we were in a drought. And it was to that point where you'd be standing online at the grocery store and people would actually be looking at each other and being like, we could really use some rain. Like we really need some rain. And finally it happened. The clouds had formed, it was starting to rain. And I turned on the radio and the weather reporter said to me, or said out loud, he said, okay, folks, it's raining. It should clear out by noon, but in the worst case scenario, it's going to keep going through the afternoon. And I literally turned and looked at the radio thinking, what? Like, we all need this rain. How is rain continuing through the afternoon the worst case scenario? That should be the best case scenario. But also, I was in Southern California and I was like, I'm pretty sure that the standard weather reporter vocabulary and assumptions is sun is good, rain is bad. And he just hadn't updated how he was talking about it to the current drought situation that we were in. And so that really started me down a path of exploration that I've continued ever since then, which is continuing to look at how do we talk about our weather patterns? How do we talk about our experiences? And where do we hold our knowledge? And in what places and in what capacities do we start to recognize, wait, what I think I know and what I experience and what I'm expecting isn't matching up with reality? And then how do we start to bring those two together? And I think with all the experiences that everyone just indicated on that poll, we're in a really profound place where almost 25% of our participants have been profoundly affected by climate change. 3/4 of you have at least experienced something. So we're in that experience phase. And so I'm going to turn it back to Elizabeth, but say that's the frame that I'm bringing to this heat question and this heat prompt is saying, how do we talk about heat? How are we thinking about it? And how are we bringing our expectations and our language and our experience to these new situations that are developing?
That's really interesting. Thank you for that, Marcy. It's actually making me think about a connection between this and another project that I'm running at the Alliance right now, which is about how museums are changing their relationships with the descendant communities around repatriation and restitution. And one of the things that has come up as I listen to people talk about it, both academics and experts and people in descendant communities, is we need to change our language because our language affects how we think about things. So, if you think about something as a collections object as opposed to a belonging or someone's possession, that changes how you think about it and your emotional and relationship and attitude towards it. And now you're making me think this is true of the weather as well. I would think it's the same thing with, everybody's talking about there's not snow anymore and we don't have snow on the mountains and the glaciers. Like, are we going to have a time when it's going to be, yay, there's going to be 4 feet of snow? That is so awesome. We really need that. Look, it's building up on the ice pack. And the other thing, just quickly, and then I want to bat it back to you, is you were talking about how your work is on this sort of conversation between the present and the past. And I would say what we're now pioneering is it's a dialogue between the past, the present, and the future, because by talking to our future selves, we can actually get ahead of some of these things where part of the problem we create is thinking about things in old terms and old points of reference.
Yeah. Elizabeth, thank you. You just sparked another memory that I have. When I was at the Park Service, I was the lead for cultural resources and climate change. And one of my colleagues in the climate program, he knew what I was doing. He was an ecologist, and he clearly had been thinking about things for a while. And he sort of finally one day he said, I have a question. He said, we keep saying everything is unprecedented and we're moving into a new climate regime. So how is how is looking at cultural research, how is that even useful if we're going into a climate regime that we don't know? And I remember just saying, thank you. He had clearly been working on phrasing that question. So I really appreciated him putting into words what was frustrating it, what was concerning him. And the answer I came up to in the moment was really, these weather regimes and that we're going into are unfamiliar. We don't know them, but we are bringing into these new times these assumptions and languages and structures of doing things and power relationships and all of those. And we need to understand where those come from so that we can negotiate and navigate them. And Elizabeth, I loved your example of the possession versus not possession, I think is also really, really powerful. And it's a powerful recognition. And one of the other pieces that I've been working with is sort of how do we define heritage at this point, which we often think of as, oh, those are pieces of the past. Yeah, an archaeologist. And what I am seeing is more and more is a recognition that there are items that we recognize in heritage, but where heritage is really held, or we're starting to recognize itself, it's actually our relationships to it. And so that is actually the functional part of it, is how we think about it and talk about it. And that makes it more flexible, and it changes what we do with it and sort of how we think about carrying it forward into the future. And are we trying to keep it exactly the same, which is one of the terms that, we've heard, you preserve it, historic preservation, you hold it the same. But we're moving into a place where we can't hold everything as the same. So where is that flexibility there?
Well, I find myself in an unfamiliar position when we start thinking about this, because normally I say to people, it may be counterintuitive, but the really hardest things to change are how people think in the culture. Even that would seem very soft and malleable, but it's actually the hardest thing to change. But now talking to you about this topic, let's say, great, everybody in this webinar and people out in the field we need to change how we think about weather and climate, and we're going to change how we talk about it. Even if tomorrow you could flip a switch and change that, it seems to me there are a lot of immutable things in the way we've created our world and where we work that can't change as quickly as theoretically our minds or our language. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is, of course, we've built a lot of infrastructure based on that language and perceptions, and that is really hard to change. And that infrastructure shapes a lot of our behavior. And so I don't know if this was in your mind, but whenever I start to hear about people saying, oh, people should they should walk to work, they should ride their bikes to work. And you're like, yes, but so much of our infrastructure has been set up for people to drive. And so it's, even if the mind is willing, the habit is hard to switch. And so, finding that flexibility is a really key piece of that. And I hadn't been thinking of sharing this, but you just, again, sparked another idea. Again, from my archaeological background, when I started in grad school, I worked with the original, he was called the God of Garbage. His name was Bill Rathje. And he was the first archaeologist to really use archaeological techniques to study modern trash. And he started in the early 70s, by the later 1980s, I don't know if anyone on the call remembers this, he was doing cores through Fresh Kills landfill in New York City. He was one of the first people to really study that. And one of the patterns that he identified through all of his studies of how people interact with trash and how they use things and throw them away is that we often have crisis behavior. And I'm going to go like this. We'll recognize there's crisis and we'll do something. And a lot of people will like, it's crisis, you need to do this. But then that behavior drops off almost as steeply. You could almost say it's like the crash diet. Like you can go on the crash diet and then you can add. But he said, if you hold on, it'll go back down. It might even go even lower than what you were originally doing. But he said, if you keep going, there's a long, slow reintegration of that practice. Mm-hmm. And I was working with him studying on recycling, and we started to see a lot of people like, got to save the planet. We're going to do recycling. And then people got tired of, well, have we saved the planet yet? Can we stop recycling? Can we do that? And it sort of pitched off. And it is always frustrating. We didn't let that curve continue with the integration of that. So that's where I'll say there's.
Okay, so that brings up a really interesting point. This is a third thing that has to change. So we've talked about minds and attitudes and how we talk about things and think about things. We've talked about the physical infrastructure. In the example you gave, it was transportation, but we might be talking about insulation and shade and how you build buildings in extreme heat, or whether people can walk across hot parking lots, which is something I've experienced. But it seems to me the other issue is systems.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the Neon Museum. You guys, I so owe you a drink if I come to Las Vegas. Totally up. So you say, great, this is great. It's 114. We're going to close during the day to protect our visitors and to protect our staff. We're going to open at 8:30. Well, if it's short term, that's fine. But if you say long term, because it's not like the climate in Las Vegas is going to get cooler again, it's going to get hotter. So it's like, how do you create a system where people can come to work in the morning, have this long break in the middle of the day, especially if you're like front of line visitors facing staff, and then come back to work from like 8:30 to 11? What do you do about childcare? How do you sync this with how your spouse is working? You said transportation. Transportation is set up for particular peak hours when people work. So what are all the systems that would have to change, even if you manage to shift the mindset and the language and the physical infrastructure?
Yeah. I was just noticing, I'm going to note to the chat, and then Elizabeth, I'm going to jump you. Several folks have asked for information about Bill Rafferty, and I will try to find some links to that. We will share them up. So thank you for that. I think it's almost, this is where people start to talk about sort of the wicked problem and the complexity of systems, because in order to change systems, you need to have the will and the people wanting to, or accepting or understanding why.
Right.
If they're understanding why, then maybe they're already doing it. And so it's this, I think that's where the struggle is do we change one first and then get the others to come along, or you're trying to change all of them at the same time? And so the systems change. So I think you're wrapping that in, is that's part of the complexity of this situation. But as you said, it's not going back.
Right.
So figuring out how to find those points of flexibility and starting to shift them. Sorry, that wasn't a real answer. Just acknowledging that's we need all the pieces is part of it. Is just changing one without understanding the other parts.
Right. So where do you find the end of the ball of yarn to begin to pull at it, and then how do you make sure it's all coming together in a complete structure instead of just creating a tangle where you can't figure out what comes next? Well, this is a good time, I think, to begin encouraging people to think about what they're going to talk about with their groups as we send them out. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to read the questions that we're going to assign you as you go out into your breakout group. And actually, you know what? I'm just going to drop them into chat too, so you can read them as I say them aloud. We came up with 3 prompts when we talked a little bit about this session. The first prompt is, how do you think about heat? What are your assumptions and what do you expect to hear? So per Marcy's story about listening to the radio, when you hear people talking about weather, climate, what are your sort of baseline assumptions about that conversation? That's one. And the second is, how are your assumptions about heat baked into your organization from operations to physical infrastructure? And I totally don't apologize for that, Pam, because it's awesome. And then the third question is, what are some tangible ways that your organization can manage heat? And if you're one of the rare organizations that is not having any issues with heat, you can substitute another climate exchange. Okay. So now my colleague who's helping us with IT is going to send you out into breakout discussions. There'll be 5 people per room. And then we're going to push you some announcements to remind you of what those questions are. And then at 3:40, we're going to bring you back into the main room and we're going to share some of our insights. So this is where I wish I could play the Jeopardy music to accompany you out into the rooms. Maybe I'll hum dum 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 dum. Hello and welcome back. I hope you've had some good chats in your breakout rooms. We're still learning this new platform, so I hope we're navigating that okay. Now I'm going to be hoping that I'll hear a lot of what you were talking about by watching what you drop in chat. So you might share observations, interesting insights, anything that really surprised you or resonated. Um, while you're beginning to do that, though, I want to pull out our second poll to gauge a tenor of the rooms. So I'm going to push a poll that is asking, okay, it is asking you, how prepared is your organization to cope with the growing reality of extreme heat? And I'm asking you to choose the option that best describes it. And the options are, we are very well prepared. We got this handled. The other one is, we can roll with the punches. We'll figure it out as things come, but we're confident we can handle it. The third one is, we haven't thought about it much. That's totally valid. And the last one is, we're in big trouble. So you know that it's a problem and you know you're not ready. So let's see what people are saying as that rolls in. And so far, it looks like we got a majority leading for we can roll with the punches, and a significant chunk of people being willing to admit we haven't thought about it much, which is totally valid. And I'm encouraged by the low number of people who think we are in deep trouble. I was wondering, I didn't actually have a preconception about how this would be answered. So this is very illuminating. Okay, it looks like it's stabilizing at about 4% saying we are very well prepared. I would make a personal ambition to help our field get that percentage go up. And then a little over half saying we can roll with the punches. So we'll adapt on the fly, as it were. About 39% being willing to say we haven't thought much about it. Thank you for your honesty. And I think that demonstrates why we have to have these conversations with the field. And then 5% saying we're in big trouble, which I'm encouraged it's that low, but still very concerned about that 5% and hope that we can find a way to help out. So I'm going to close the poll now. And I'm going to start keeping my eye on chat. So Marcy, let's watch together and let's call out anything that we think is interesting that people are sharing about the conversations.
I just say I'm noticing someone saying I'm having trouble with flooding too, and that reminds me another experience that I've had is I was asked when I was with the National Park Service, I was asked over and over again, which park is the most at risk? They wanted the list, and I would have to say, at risk from what? You know, if you want sea level rise, we could probably come up with a list, but if you want flooding, if you want heat, if you want wildfire, those are different lists. And almost everyone is vulnerable to something, but
yes.
and probably overlapping, but it's
there is this great risk map. I'm sorry. I will find the link and share it again if I can, but there's this great risk map that's a cumulative risk map of all of these. It's heat, it's flood, it's wildfire, it's extreme cold. And I actually looked at it. I was doing a thought exercise for a talk I was giving in Finland about what would it take to create a museum that would last 10,000 years. And I decided that the climatically safest place to put a museum in the United States to last 10,000 years was Eastern Washington State. Anyway, so I'm noticing somebody commenting and people upvoting this comment that their organization is more oriented towards emergency response than preparedness.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good point, because, you know, when a museum goes through its core documents, one of the core documents is having an emergency preparedness plan. But our field has not yet evolved to the point where it's a norm expected thing for a museum to have, like a sustainability plan or to bake into the long-term planning for the building and grounds. What are these projections of risk to layer on top of our development plans? I also think this is a good example of where the needs of the field may be out of sync with the traditions of funding. Because, of course, the way museums usually get a lot of money to do capital projects is a donor is happy to have their name on a new building. That's awesome. But if what you need to do is really not build a new building, but retrofit everything you've got to be flood-proof, that's a harder thing perhaps to put a name on, and maybe it's less attractive to the kinds of funders who could make major investments.
Yeah.
Ooh, I am just going to point out that Tatiana posted a link saying, oh, gosh darn it, I lost it already. Excellent, an excellent resource for building climate resilience plans. Yay, thank you. www.resilience.culturalheritage.org. Thank you for that. I also wanted to share a conversation that Marcy and I started while we were behind stage while you were in the breakout rooms, which is about managed retreat. So we have a few communities in the US, not many, who are basically having to face up to the fact that they can't live there anymore. And the example that I named, and forgive me if I'm mangling the name, is the Ile de St. Charles in Louisiana, where the indigenous people there are being flooded out of what little remaining land they had because of rising sea levels and increasing storms on the Gulf Coast. And the federal government has finally basically said, yeah, you're right, you can't live there anymore. We're going to pay to relocate you. But there are many other communities in the US that in the long term probably are unsustainable. I'm not going to name them, but maybe in you chat, if you think you were living someplace where in 20 years you think it's not realistic that everything could be where it is now. And I'm really looking for models of communities in the US that are beginning to talk about this, about do we have to move? It's not just a matter of armoring the buildings or having more shade. It's that this community is going to have to relocate either to other existing communities, or this is one example that actually happened historically, you know, a community that was next to the Mississippi River simply upped and moved the whole town to the top of the bluffs because they kept getting flooded. So that's a small example, but similar things might happen. So I'm wondering if there are cities in the US that are beginning to say, you know, in 40 or 50 years, we're going to have to figure out how to be 40 miles inland. Oh, thank you, Ricky. John Darlington, who's written about these heritage communities having to move. Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting and depressing stories. We were turned down for funding for an elevation of a historic structure by a state agency that supports flood mitigation, saying elevation was not a mitigation effort. It's more of an adaptation, I guess, if you're talking about infrastructure.
This is another one of those system issues, is the policies that we often have for heritage.
Right.
Still prioritize keeping things exactly as they are and not allowing them to move. There are some efforts to change that, but it's not yet really consistent.
Yeah, Michael from the Boston Children's Museum commented, agreed, raising up our utilities out of harm's way from sea level rise is not the sexiest sell to donors. I know the Chrysler Museum of Art went ahead and took everything from their basement, which of course is where you stick the utilities. It's better than putting your collection storage down there. And they moved that up to the roof.
Yeah.
And that, I'm sure that was a major investment.
Yeah.
Oh, so somebody's suggesting that Florida as a whole state may have to relocate. Interesting thought. That's another, I'm just going to throw this in as another interesting topic I'm watching. One of the other side effects of climate change and forced migration is what's being called climate gentrification. So historically, there are a lot of areas where the undesirable places to live, where people of color and from immigrant communities, the only place they could afford housing was like on the edges of town and up on the bluffs instead of the beautiful waterfront property. Well, guess what? Now that the waterfront property is flooding and becoming inundated, developers are saying, oh, wow, what we should be doing is buying up the property that's in these other communities because that's going to be safe. And then that's pricing out and displacing the people who historically actually lived there. Oh, Danielle, thanks for calling out the Frankenthaler Climate Initiative grant program. Yes, yes, yes. Total, I'm upvoting that. And thank you for including a link. And thank you, Craig, for bringing up insurance costs. This is another thing that Marcy and I were chatting about behind the scenes. We're seeing that there are many areas of the US where underwriters are simply refusing to write new policies for homeowners, which is certainly going to affect who can live in an area, both in terms of, again, gentrification or pricing out certain people. But I'm also wondering whether it's going to start affecting museums as well. I have not yet been approached by a museum that said their insurer is saying, we got to look at this. This is not a good deal. But I'm wondering if that will happen at some point. And somebody is noting the Blue Ridge area of Appalachia is someplace experiencing climate gentrification. And again, that's an issue of displacement, because then those people have to go somewhere. Where are they going to go? Yes, thank you, Marianne. Miami and Little Haiti is exactly the example I had first read about in people pointing to climate displacement and gentrification. California is in insurance crisis with many companies pulling up. And Maine, oh, I didn't know it was happening in Maine. Thank you, Joy. I will go look at that. And one person saying that in Arizona, at the last go round, only one company was willing to offer property coverage. Thank you. That's the first signal I've heard of it beginning to impact museums. Many places in northern Ontario where insurance won't insure against forest fires. Okay, I didn't know that was true of Ontario, but thank you for putting that on my radar. So it's, again, there may be cases where people are saying, well, we'll issue general insurance, but we're not going to insure you against this specific risk, when that's a significant risk. So then what are you going to do? Self-insure against that risk, which essentially means building up a significant stockpile of funds you could use to mitigate damage. Yes, Ricky, 1 hour is too short to cover this issue. It is. It's meant to be a little brain stimulation.
Yep.
Dun, 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 dun. So Marcy, as we begin to approach the end, are there any things you want to pull out of the chat or your thoughts as you've been watching these discussions?
Well, for all of these points are so powerful and so well phrased and captured. I think one of the ideas that it sparked as I've seen these go by is, when I started working in climate change, there was a lot of effort put into, well, we need the modeling, we need to understand where things are going to go so that we can get our infrastructure planned and so that we can know what's going to happen. And the realization now is there isn't a fixed point, or there may not be a fixed point, is that ability to sort of roll with the punches. And what if the heat might go a certain way, or it might get hotter, or it might become more unpredictable, or you may have these compounding, overlapping stresses that layer on top of each other. And so I'm really curious if folks were talking about, is heat baked into their plans, and where is it possible to meet that with flexibility? Is there behavioral flexibility? Is there physical flexibility? Is there funding flexibility? And just, are they seeing any of that? Or is there more still an effort to plan for a specific target, which I think is, again, that older model of thinking, but it's hard to get out of. Heat, smoke, earthquake, and volcanoes. Oh my. I have also been in touch. There's some wonderful colleagues over in England, with Historic England, Robin Pender, if many of you know her name, who's been talking a lot about the issues of thermal comfort and trying to understand the human relationship to heat. And we have some longstanding expectations around heat and cooling. And I thought I saw a couple of comments here about AC can itself be a problem. It can be too cold. It can raise its own issues. But trying to understand ways before a lot of availability of AC, how did buildings and how did people regulate their own temperature? And can we start to bring some of those back? So that was also in my mind of our own, again, it's back to our own perceptions and what do we expect and what feels comfortable, and how do we start to update that, and our ability to be flexible and to move with change, or work with change. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, I'm seeing somebody comment on another toolkit. We're going to collect all these and I'm going to put them into a blog post.
Yeah, so many good toolkits.
So one of the things I said at the beginning is this is a culture of confidentiality. I really appreciate what you've shared in chat. If it's in chat, I'm not going to go sharing it saying, hey, somebody said in chat this was happening at their museum. But I am posting in chat an invitation with my email address. If you are willing to share any of these stories officially, if you're willing to write a guest post for the CFM blog about how you're having to change your infrastructure, or if you're experiencing insurance challenges, or if you are actually helping your community think about what are we going to do when we lose the first half mile of our coastal front in the next 20 years, because we know it's going to happen. I'd really love to get it on record, published, where I can point to it and say, this is an example we should talk about. Okay, I'm also, as we get close to the end, this is the first chat in a series, and I really would like to get your help in improving it. So I am posting in chat a link to a SurveyMonkey survey with just 3 questions asking you about how this went so that we can improve it. And also feel free to drop in chat your comments about what you liked, what you didn't like, challenges, and we'll pull that out, because we want to keep these going in the future and make sure we're spending the right amount of time on what parts. I'd also love to know what other things you'd like to hear about. I also want to make sure I mention that this fall, we're going to be diving even deeper into issues of climate change and what museums can do to mitigate their impact on climate or help their communities adapt, and other trends affecting the future of museums and their communities, including artificial intelligence and culture wars and the epidemic of loneliness. And we'll be doing that at the 2nd annual Future of Museums Summit. I am also dropping in chat a link to where we were posting updates and information on the summit as it evolves. And we will soon be announcing that registration is open and sharing the program. But to the point of people who said 1 hour isn't enough to address this, I absolutely agree. And I hope that you join us at the summit to spend some more quality time hearing from wonderful colleagues at other institutions who are digging into this in more deeply. Marcy, any closing thoughts or observations for our attendees?
As I'm sitting here going like this because it's warm in Washington, D.C. today, I will just say thank you so much for all of this engagement. And I think what this has shown is all of these questions and issues are very real and very active. And this chance to bring them together and to share the tools and the experiences we have is really, really powerful. One final story I will share. I had the chance to be in Scotland, up in the islands, and we were there talking with communities that were having archaeological sites eroding out along the coast. And before I left, I had sent some questions to my colleagues across the Park Service saying, this is where I'm going, what questions do you have? And we'd been working on these issues. And we were talking to this one homeowner who had a cemetery that was eroding out into the North Atlantic. And she said, these are the ancestors of the people in the village. What am I supposed to do? And, it was so heartfelt. And she turned and looked at me and said, what is the US doing? And I gave her the best explanation. I said, we're working on this. And then I shared the examples of some colleagues in Alaska and along the Carolina coast that were also literally dealing with eroding cemeteries. And what seemed to matter to her, what touched her the most, it wasn't that I had a solution, but that she wasn't alone. She wasn't facing this by herself.
Yeah.
She didn't have immediate help in dealing with it, but the sense of she was not the only one facing this challenge. And just that sense of community, that there are many other people saying, this is a problem. I am trying to deal with this thing. I almost saw, it was almost a relief that she wasn't alone. And so this ability to bring us together to even share the questions and the issues, saying, I'm working on this, this is a problem, knowing that it's shared is probably a really strong place to start.
I can't think of a more perfect wrap up, Marcy. Thank you. If what we did today was help people feel like that they share this challenge with their peers and that we're all in it together and that we will have some way to tackle it together, that's wonderful. As you exit the room, I just want to leave you with one challenge. Next time you're reading the news, whether it's in a newspaper or online, pick a story that leaps out at you as being interesting and spend a few minutes either in your own head or with colleagues or friends or your family having this kind of talk, saying, what does it mean? What does it tell us about what's going on in the world? What does it tell us about impact on our community or where we work or our personal futures? This is the beginnings. This is the seeds of foresight. This is how you begin to think about the future. And I'm so happy you could join me today to do a little bit of futures thinking together. Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and everyone for the chance to be here. I'm really grateful.